time to the gentleman, and I'm so happy to see him here tonight.
Well, I want to thank you, Ms. Capta, for your leadership role in this whole issue. You know, when we talk about the Beltway mentality, and we talk about the degree to which Washington, D.C. and the United States Congress are separated from the pain and the anguish of middle-income America, I think you could not give a clearer example of that separation than this $40 billion bailout for Mexico. Now, two things are happening at exactly the same time. The president and congressional leaders are talking about a $40 billion bailout. For a start, what we are hearing is that because we have a terrible deficit situation, it may be necessary to destroy our Social Security system, upon which tens of millions of senior citizens exist. There is no question but that the Republican leadership has in mind massive cuts in Medicare, in Medicaid, massive cuts in nutrition programs for hungry children. So on one hand, what we hear every single day on the floor of this House is, we have a terrible deficit situation, therefore we're going to have to cut back on the basic needs, the substantive needs of some of the most desperate people in this country because of the deficit. And then in the same breath, what we hear is, well, we've got to protect Wall Street, who are making investments in Mexico, and therefore we're going to have to co-sign a $40 billion loan guarantee. That's number one. And the second line of rhetoric that we hear is that we are entering into an era of so-called personal responsibility. What we are saying to hungry children in America, we have 5 million kids who are hungry, we are saying, well, you know what? In the new United States of America, don't expect the federal government to provide you with basic nutrition. And we say to the elderly people who have paid in to Social Security and Medicare for their whole lives, don't expect the federal government to stand with you in your time of need. Personal responsibility. You got to do it on your own, right? No free lunch. But at exactly at this same moment, we have investors who are interested in buying bonds from Mexico, bonds, by the way, which are paying 19 or 20% returns.
And with the gentleman yield, one of the interesting points here is how people get a hold of these bonds. You know, part of what Mexico owes is money that's owed on the old Brady bonds. For those of you who are TV junkies, maybe you know this. Back in the 1980s, early 1980s, there was all kinds of debt that Mexico couldn't pay back then. So part of it was turned into these Brady bonds. The yield on Brady bonds was 40%. Can you imagine? Just think if you own those bonds. So part of these are being rolled over as a part of this new debt that Mexico has to pay to its creditors. Now with this new group, they're paying 20% at the moment, but of course it could go up. Wouldn't we love for the depositors in our communities to be able to earn a 40% interest rate at their bank?
But what I get a kick out of is in this era of personal responsibility, it is not enough that you may very well and probably likely earn a 20% rate of return on your investment. But we're saying to these very brave investors, well, if you don't make that 20%, if the Mexican economy does not improve, if by some chance they're not able to pay you back, don't worry about it. Uncle Sam and the taxpayers are here to bail you out. And the irony, and I know you and I had discussed this earlier, the irony that some of the people that we are protecting are exactly the same people who have thrown American workers out on the street, taken their jobs to Mexico, and now they're going back to these unemployed workers and saying, we want you to provide guarantees to the companies that are investing in Mexico today. To say that that is absurd would be a, I think, massive understatement.
If I might just reclaim a moment here, last week, therefore, I sent a letter along with several members of Congress to our Secretary of Treasury asking 14 very specific questions, since we aren't going to have hearings here in Congress on this major bailout. I won't read all 14 questions, but just the first two, asking him to please expeditiously reply to these questions. Number one, in view of the fact that U.S. banks are earning historic profits? Why is this U.S. government intervention in the form of a currency swap and lines of credit, this was the $18 billion from last week, necessary? When the private sector gambles and loses, shouldn't those losses be borne by the private sector? That's question one. Question two is, to what specific banking and corporate interests does Mexico owe the $26 billion in outstanding obligations that come due this year, $10 billion due in this first quarter of the year, and $16 billion of which is allegedly owed to U.S. interests, the rest being owed to Japanese interests and German interests, which means our people's tax dollars would have to pay for foreign creditors to Mexico, and how much in additional obligations come due in 1996 and 1997. But the bottom line is, specifically, not in general, to whom is it owed? Which Wall Street investment houses? Which speculative investors that are out there in our country and elsewhere? If our people are going to pay this off, all we're asking, let us know who we owe the bills to.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the point that has to be made over and over again is that at a time when America for working people is becoming a poorer and poorer country, at a time when the gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider, when so many middle-income people need help, what an absurdity, what an outrage that the United States government today, the President and leaders of Congress, are proposing not to stand with middle-income people, not to stand with the poor or the working people, but they are going to provide $40 billion of loan guarantees to very, very profitable Wall Street investors. And if that doesn't tell you who controls the United States Congress, then I think you may never know it. I would hope very much that we can turn this process about. I think, Ms. Kaptur, it's going to come to the floor next week. Is that what they are?
That's what we're told, Friday, when everybody's worn out and they want to get home to meet with their constituents over the weekend. So they're going to bring the balanced budget amendments up early in the week and all the discussion on that, so people will be all vented out by the end of the week. There would have been no hearings anywhere in the House, and they'll just slip it in here from the Rules Committee.
I would just say to the American taxpayers that if you think that the best use of your money now is to guarantee loans to Mexico, money that is going to be made by large investment houses and big banks, why then you should call the President of the United States up, you should call your member of Congress and say, that is exactly how I want to see my tax dollars being spent. Go for it. We think it's a great idea. But if you are concerned about a $200 billion deficit, if you are concerned that there are people here in Congress who say that because of the deficit, we've got to cut back on Medicare, on Medicaid, on nutrition programs for hungry kids, and you think that a $40 billion loan guarantee for Mexico is not how you want to see your tax dollars being spent, then I think also you should get on the phone, you should call up Speaker Gingrich, you should call up my office, Ms. Kaptur's office, and the office of your representative in Congress, your United States Senator. We can defeat this thing if millions of Americans stand up and say, no, let's get our priorities straight. We have other things to do with our tax dollars other than to bail out Mexico and protect investments from large banks and investment houses. So let us get our priorities straight. Let us flood the United States Congress with calls, with letters, and say to the members of this institution, no bailout for Mexico, protect the American taxpayer.
If the gentleman would yield. Not surprisingly, because this has happened before, Mexico has many wealthy families, and they have billions of dollars worth in deposits. And you might ask yourself, where is that money? If you look back at 1991, there were about 2 billionaires in Mexico, according to Fortune magazine. Now there are over 2 dozen. Where do they have their money? You know what happened back in the early 1980s when Mexico got in trouble before and it owed several billion dollars? There was between $40 and $60 billion of money from citizens in Mexico deposited in U.S. banks, the very banks that Mexico owed the money to. So, being very simple-minded, I said, just let them take their money back home. What happened in this particular situation is, and it was very carefully orchestrated, the smart money left Mexico before the peso meltdown. And if you look at the trade figures for the last year, you'll see that one of the top 3 exports to Mexico from the United States after NAFTA has been in three interesting areas: arts, antiques, and collectibles. Now, who would buy arts, antiques, and collectibles to hedge against a possible devaluation? So they took their money out of the country, brought into the country goods that would sell anywhere in the world. There is money there. Part of our job should be to draw it back in the country rather than let it escape. And I yield to the gentleman.
You're not suggesting that the patriotic billionaires in Mexico are not going to themselves reinvest in their own country. You're not suggesting that they might take their own money out of their own country and put that money into American banks so that the working people of the United States who are losing jobs because our jobs are being taken to Mexico should bail out these investors and these billionaires. You're not suggesting that incredulous thought, are you?
This is why we asked the Secretary of Treasury which specific interests, which banks, which investment houses, which corporate interests are Mexico's creditors at this point. We'd like to see who owns those firms. We'd like to see who the depositors are. We'd like to understand who we're giving our money to, because it's likely, based on past history, that Mexico will default again, and the taxpayers of the United States, the new insurance company to Mexico, will have to bail them out. We just want to know who we're bailing out. Don't you think the American people have a right to know?
I think that they might, given the fact that they are putting $40 billion on the line. I think what people throughout this country should appreciate is that very often when the president and any president, when the leaders of Congress want to get something done that benefits the wealthiest 1 or 2% and puts it to the average American, what they do is move very, very quickly, because their feeling is that the less information the average American has about the situation, the better able they are able to pull off the swindle. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing right now. It is astounding to me that when some of us say, let's do something about the 5 million children in America who are hungry, let's provide help to them, there is never a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
When we talk about changing our trade policies so that we do not encourage American corporations to take our jobs to China or to Mexico or to poor third world countries, there is never a sense of urgency. But suddenly, boy, are things flying around here. $40 billion, even in Washington, D.C., is a lot of money. $40 billion of loan guarantees can rebuild communities from one end of America to the other, could put millions of American people back to work at decent wages. Suddenly, however, for some reason, however, that discussion never takes place here. But now, because Wall Street and the investment houses want to make sure they're not going to lose any money on their Mexican investments, wham, like a bullet, is that process flying through here.
You know, what's really sad, too, is that if you look at the people that get appointed to our U.S. Treasury and get appointed to the Federal Reserve, not that they're not intelligent and hardworking Americans, but their mindset comes from, especially this group over the last several years, from the speculative Wall Street sector, which means that when they've been used to creating all this debt and around the world, and they're pretty well heeled themselves, then when they get appointed to a top government position, they forget that they're not just dealing with their own customers' funds anymore. They are dealing with taxpayer dollars, public money, and there's a difference. And I think one of the problems is that when you have this revolving door between Wall Street and some of the major institutions of the people of the United States, sometimes I think people forget where they are and they start gambling with our people's money rather than their private investors and speculators and gamblers' money. And I think there's a big difference. You know, Congressman Sanders, and I see Congressman Lipinski has joined us here. I'm sure you face this situation in your own districts. I can't get loans for my congressional district from the U.S. Treasury in order to clean up the toxic waterways in my community. They've told us, well, wait 5 years, wait 10 years, wait 15 years. I said, wait a minute, I'm only elected for 2 years. I can't wait 15. What do you mean I have to wait 15 years? I came here to help make it better. Can't get loans for that. I can't get money to build a new tower out at our airport field, out at our airport, so that the airplanes don't crash into one another as they're landing, because we have such an old tower that it's on the wrong side of the runway. Well, we can't get that built. Can't get a loan from Treasury backed up by the taxpayers of the United States to do that. I couldn't get money for an enterprise community in the center of our city because there wasn't enough to go around to every major city in Ohio. I couldn't get the attention of the Federal Reserve or the U.S. Treasury on that. I can't get more money out of this government to add to the new police class that's being hired in my major city and many of the rural communities in my district that are trying to hire additional police officers because of the drug problem. And do you know the chief transit route to Toledo, Ohio, in terms of the drug trade, direct from Mexico, comes right up to our community. I can't get a loan from our government to help us deal with the crime situation in our community. So it gets pretty discouraging when you see the enthusiasm of these former Wall Street speculators down here helping their friends, but I can't deliver as fast as I want to for the people of my home district, as hard as we try. I wanted to acknowledge that we've been joined by Congressman Bill Lipinski, a most esteemed member from the great city of Chicago, which I like to call the capital of the Midwest. And I know how hard he has tried to not just help his own city, but this entire nation through his work here and his years of service. And we welcome you this evening, Congressman Lipinski.
Well, I thank Congresswoman Kaptur for those very kind words, and also for the time that she is going to yield to me in this special order. And it's always a pleasure also to be associated with Congressman Sanders, because certainly no one fights harder for the American working man than he does. Mr. Speaker, it appears that the North American Free Trade Agreement is anything but free. Let's look at the facts. Under NAFTA, thousands of Americans have been put out of work. Under NAFTA, the Sara Lee Corporation intends to cut 8,000 jobs during the next several months and move their operations to Mexico. Under NAFTA, Honda, BMW, Volkswagen, Toyota, and Samsung all announced plans to build new or expanded production facilities in Mexico, not here in the U.S. of A. Under NAFTA, U.S. automobile makers exported approximately 22,000 vehicles to Mexico. The U.S., however, imported 221,000 from Mexico, a huge imbalance in Mexico's favor. Can you imagine the jobs that would have been created here amongst the United Auto Workers if the 221,000 vehicles that were manufactured in Mexico had been manufactured here in the United States?
If the gentleman would let me just reclaim my time for a second. I had somebody divide it out for me. What it works out to is that for every 28 cars that come up from Mexico to the United States, we send down 2 cars. And in trucks, it's even worse. For every 33 trucks that are built by these companies sent into our market, we send down there about a third of a truck. It's absolutely upside down.
Certainly, and to me, the number one issue in last November's election was the fear, the concern, the insecurity that the American middle class has on their shrinking standard of living, not only for themselves, but for their family, for their youngsters. And here we, with NAFTA, with GATT, and now this $40 billion bailout, we are not only shipping out middle-class jobs, we are also now putting an additional burden on the middle class to subsidize another country. To return to my prepared remarks, under NAFTA, U.S. imports from Mexico have been increasing at a rate faster than U.S. exports to Mexico. This distinction is important because in order to create jobs, U.S. exports must be expanding faster than imports. This is not happening. Under NAFTA, the peso's value has dropped fantastically. This represents a dramatic wage cut for Mexican workers. Consequently, U.S. exports to Mexico will slow, while Mexico's exports to the United States will rise, wiping out what little trade advantage we had. Under NAFTA, Mexico is experiencing a severe financial crisis, and the American taxpayer is being asked to foot the bill. I say enough is enough. The Clinton administration wants to provide $40 billion in loan guarantees to help Mexico. But as reported in yesterday's Washington Post, this multi-billion-dollar bailout will only help U.S. speculators, those who have invested money in Mexican stocks and bonds and not contributed to Mexico's long-term economic stability. Any way you look at it, taxpayers are being forced to prop up the peso and assume the financial risk of the investors. Mr. Speaker, it is not their risk to take. We should be offering support for our citizens, but instead our government chooses to help every other group except the American working man and woman. Last week, I joined my colleagues, two of which are here tonight, in introducing legislation to pull the U.S. out of NAFTA. Given the current circumstances, such action is indeed timely and long overdue. During the debate on NAFTA, supporters promised jobs and economic growth. I and others, however, warned that NAFTA would only hurt our trade position and cause an increase in the loss of American jobs. After a year of NAFTA, I think today's reality speaks for itself. Mr. Speaker, repealing NAFTA is essential if we are to restore justice to the working people of America. This issue, to me, is an enormously important issue and goes right to the heart of the stability of this nation, not only the middle class, but everyone in this nation. We have to produce jobs in this country for all our citizens. We have to come up with what is a dirty word around here quite often, but a national industrial policy. We have to have government, management, labor, the universities working together to develop an economic strategy to put our people to work. If we don't, there is going to come a day when they are not going to be able to purchase these products from Mexico, from Japan, from Germany. This economy is going to go down the drain, and numerous other economies are going to go down the drain. I'm really very thankful for the opportunity to participate in this special order tonight, and both of you have my total and complete support in this effort to try to rebuild the American middle class and to try to create jobs in this nation. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentleman for his heartfelt and enlightened statement, and I know that probably in Chicago, as is true in Toledo and Vermont, the fastest growing category of jobs are temporary jobs, part-time jobs with no benefits. We have some restaurant work jobs being created. We have some healthcare jobs being created. In our factories, what's happened is some people, because of the uptick in the auto industry, and I come from automotive America, we have been able to bring some people back into the plants, but we haven't seen the kind of massive hiring that we would have expected with the kind of profits that are being made, because extra people aren't being hired. What we're seeing is workers are working 6-7 days a week. They've been doing this now for over 2 years, and they're making good money, but they're exhausted because they've had a lot of overtime, but the benefits aren't shared with more. Imagine if we could put 1,000 more people, 2,000 more people to work in our plants, and we continue to see in our country declining buying power, because essentially what these money traders are doing is they don't understand the difference between money and wealth, and the fact that there's a difference between piling debt up and creating real investment that produces things, be it agricultural or industrial, that creates real wealth in our communities. There's a book, I think, that's been written, Barbarians at the Gate, that talks about how these folks on Wall Street behave, and they think that money and paper and piling up this debt really means something, and they miss the most important question, and that is the wealth producing capacity of our country. And we've been about, with their kind of thinking, trying to make money for the few, but not wealth for the many. And I know how hard the gentleman has worked in his capacity on the Public Works Committee to try to improve the climate for business in America, our ports, seaports, airports, roadways, railroad beds, to try to make us the most efficient producer in the world. And I know the problems you have run into. Imagine if your committee had the chairman of the Federal Reserve and the head of the Treasury come in and say, okay, Chairman Lipinski, how about $40 billion in public works for America? Wouldn't that have been a great feeling?
Be fantastic.
If I could just interrupt you. If Mr. Lipinski had made that request, they would have said, what are you smoking? Are you out of your mind? $40 billion? We can't afford that, right?
No question about it. No question about it.
But these guys come in a few weeks ago, and we're supposed to pass this thing with virtually no committee debate. I gather no committee debate whatsoever. Bring it on to the floor of the House, because the big money people want to be protected. It is really quite incredible. And the other irony that I would point out, Mr. Lipinski quite correctly talked about the impact of NAFTA 1 year later, right? Loss of jobs, lessening of the trade balance. 14 months ago, when we were debating that issue here, who would have believed, after hearing all that the proponents told us, right? It is going to improve the standard of living of Mexican workers. It is going to create untold jobs in America. 14 months come and go, and what we're talking about now is the collapse of the Mexican economy, the decline in the value of the peso by 40%, and a $40 billion bailout. And you know what gets me? Where are all the editorial writers? Every major newspaper in America told us what a great, remember that?
Remember it very, very well, no question about it.
We should cut those articles out, actually.
We should
have a big board. All this was supposed to do for America, with the name of the author right there.
We were the crazy protectionists. At worst, we were racist, right?
That's very true, yes.
We were anti-Mexico. 14 months have come and gone. Where are the editorial writers today telling us what a good deal NAFTA was? What they're telling us now, these same exact people, is, well, excuse us, I guess we're going to have to pony up another $40 billion to protect Mexico.
You know, Congressman Sanders, one thing I think we would all be interested in, I call the NAFTA deal and deals like it death by pinpricks, because you have companies shutting down like Mattel Fisher-Price did yesterday in Medina, New York, but the workers from Medina, New York don't always let us know that they've lost their jobs and their production has been outsourced. And I think it's very hard to get this information. We collect some of it, but there are just hundreds and hundreds of small companies, some of them employing under 50 people around our country, that have shut down. I'm hoping if those citizens of our country who are listening, who've been really put out of a job this past year, because, and in fact, some of them have literally had to go down to Mexico and train their replacement worker, I hope you will call our offices. I hope you will let us know who you are. We will be your voice here. And we need to be your voice here, because you don't have voices from Wall Street who are placed in high positions. You don't have people in some of the major financial instruments of this government who are your voice. We can be your voice if you will let us know who you are. Some of you who are in union shops, You are organized, you know how to get to us. Many of you are in non-union shops. 85% of you are in non-union shops. We need to know who you are. We will be your voice here in the Congress of the United States. I yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. I wanted to say that, I have nothing against people in this economy becoming millionaires, becoming billionaires. But I believe that it is really the duty and the responsibility of the executive branch of government and the legislative branch of government to try to create an economy that improves the standard of living of all the citizens of this country. That should be our #1 priority, to improve the standard of living of everyone here. And we should see to it that there are some kind of checks and balances so that one segment of our society doesn't benefit more than another segment of our society, particularly when it seems to me that the laws we often pass and the trade treaties we often pass here benefit a much smaller segment of our society at the expense of one of the largest sections of our society, the middle class. I really believe that that should be the top priority, creating jobs in this country, as I say, not only for the middle class, but for everyone. If you can become a millionaire, wonderful. You become a billionaire, that's wonderful also. But we have to give the opportunity to people to continually improve their standard of living, continually improve their jobs so that they can raise their family, educate their family, so they can buy homes, so they can buy automobiles. This is really what the American dream is about, not a few people becoming billionaires or millionaires.
Will the gentleman yield on that point? On the food stamp program, which is not a politically popular program, I think it's important in my district to put on the record half the people in my Northwest Ohio area who are on food stamps, half are working people. They are working families who earn such low wages with such low benefits because their jobs have essentially been cashed out. They have to be in the embarrassing position, and I've seen some of them, of applying for these food stamps because they can no longer earn a living wage in the United States of America. Frankly, I think that should be unconstitutional. I think these people should be able to earn a decent wage. I met a woman the other day. I went into one of the stores to buy like these muffins in the morning, and I met a woman. She was working 3 part-time jobs. She was a divorcee, and she must be putting in 60 to 70 hours a week just to support herself. It's sobering to meet these families, and there are millions of them across our country, and they have very little voice here. We have been joined by our distinguished colleague from the state of New York, from Buffalo, New York, Chairman John LaFalce, Small Business Committee, Chairman of Subcommittees on the Banking Committee, and someone who was right months and months ago, and they wouldn't listen to you, Chairman LaFalce. They wouldn't listen to you. And I hope that the citizens of Buffalo understand what kind of voice they have here in Washington, not just for themselves, but for the nation and the world. There are few members of this body that understand as much about finance. And I think you talked yourself until you were blue in the face to try to get provisions in that NAFTA accord to deal with this very crisis. And they wouldn't do it. They tried to ride their tractors right over you. You probably still got skid marks on your spine. And yet you were right. But as I said a little bit earlier, this is one of those situations where it hurts to have been right. And we welcome you this evening, and I yield you time.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to congratulate the gentlelady from Ohio for the tremendous leadership that she has shown, not simply on this issue, but on all issues affecting the industrial, manufacturing, service sector within the United States, especially as international trade impacts on those issues and our domestic workers. I have long been concerned with the problems of Mexico and the problems of the Mexican people. I remember well August of 1982 when the debt crisis first erupted. and I engaged in a great many meetings at that time with the point man for the Reagan administration, Tim McNamara, who was also a fellow graduate of Villanova University. He was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. I believed firmly at that time that we had a responsibility to help the Mexican people in Mexico. I believe firmly that we should engage in leadership on the issue of debt relief. And we pretty much ran up against deaf ears. I remember in '82 going to a meeting of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in Toronto in order to discuss these and so many other issues. And again, I remember the speech that President Reagan gave at the time. We must rely on the magic of the marketplace. Burl Sprinkle was quite active in the Treasury Department too, and he presented a good many difficulties in dealing with, in a human, considerate, responsible way with the problem. In 1986, I was able to get two provisions in the omnibus trade bill that we passed at that time. One dealt with exchange rates, and one dealt with debt relief. Unfortunately, President Reagan vetoed that bill, and in vetoing the bill, he cited four specific provisions. Three of them were provisions that I had authored, and two being the exchange rate provision and the debt relief provision. Fortunately, I was able to get those provisions back in the omnibus trade bill of 1988, and they then became the law of the land. So I have a long history of concern for the problems of Mexico and extending debt relief to them, and for the whole question of sustainable exchange rates as they impact trade and the rights of capital and the rights of labor between and amongst the trading countries of the world. I was very dissatisfied with the approach that was taken by Secretary of the Treasury Jim Baker when he came up with the Baker Plan. It was a half-hearted effort. It just didn't go nearly far enough. And I remember when Nick Brady came in as Secretary of the Treasury, he called me into the office before the November '88 election and said, "We're going to go way beyond Baker, but after the election, we'll come up with something new," which turned out to be the Brady Plan, which basically was what I had called for in the '88 legislation. I remember going down and talking with the leaders of the central bank in Mexico at the time. Still there. I remember going down and talking with the chief debt negotiator, Angel Gurria, who is now the foreign minister of Mexico, etc. I remember fondly being invited by the president-elect Salinas to attend his inauguration on December 1st, 1988. But then we came up with a lot of new ideas too. Despite the fact that Mexico was a greatly underdeveloped country, we were going to treat it as a fully developed country, and because we wanted to fulfill somebody's grand vision of a free trade agreement for the Americas, we would enter into a free trade agreement with Mexico called NAFTA. Now, I had strongly favored the free trade agreement with Canada, although even then I said we ought not to enter into that agreement without having provisions for exchange rates, although I didn't think the necessity of a provision for exchange rates was that imperative for Canada, because the swing in exchange rates in currencies evaluations was not that great between the United States and Canada. But with respect to Mexico, I said it was absolutely imperative. There were a number of other things that were absolutely imperative if we were to approve NAFTA and have a good agreement. I used my small business committee to have a good many hearings on some of those conditions that I thought had to be dealt with before we approved NAFTA. And so in 1992, I had hearings on the problems in Chiapas. And I brought up so many of the human rights activists from Chiapas to discuss their problems. And I said, these problems are festering and will soon erupt, and NAFTA may make them erupt unless we do something about it beforehand. And then shortly after that, in early 1993, 2 years ago, I had a hearing on something that I thought was perhaps the most important issue that we had to deal with and could deal with within the NAFTA, and that was the issue of the valuation of the peso. I had a hearing entitled, "Whither Goeth the Peso?" And we brought in some of the leading economists from around the world. And there was pretty much a general consensus at that time that the peso was overvalued by, from 15 to 20%. And that a devaluation was going to have to take place. Not the trickle type of devaluation that was taking place on a day-by-day basis, but something much more significant at some point in time. And the only question was when and how harmful such a devaluation would be. And I argued that it was imperative that we anticipate that problem, deal with it in advance. And so I sent many letters. I sent first and foremost a letter to President Clinton, but also to the Secretary of the Treasury, at least at that time, to the present Secretary of the Treasury, who was then chairman of the National Economic Council, to the United States Trade Representative Mickey Cantor, to the head of the Business Roundtable's section on NAFTA, who at that time was the chairman of Eastman Kodak, Kay Whitmore. And I said, okay, if NAFTA is going to pass, it ought to be a good NAFTA. It ought to be a NAFTA that protects American workers. And we can't have a good NAFTA unless we have a provision dealing with exchange rates. Something that will call for consultation, coordination, and corrective measures in the event of some type of devaluation. Well, as the gentlelady pointed out, my early warnings 2 years ago fell on absolute deaf ears. The problem is, at that time, the peso was about 3.2 to the dollar, or 3,200 of the old pesos to the dollar. And of course, there had been a devaluation from 82 to 92 of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000%. We weren't talking about modest devaluations. We were talking about volatile, extreme devaluations.
If I might reclaim my time just to
Yes.
inform the gentleman, there are about 2 minutes left in this special order.
All right. Let me just make this point. We have to be very careful before we go ahead and approve a $40 billion loan guarantee. The administration and the Congress, Democrat and Republican, are dedicated to doing this by next Friday without congressional hearings, without exposing this to the crucible of examination, cross-examination, public opinion. We have to be very careful. Otherwise, we're going to freeze that exchange rate in the vicinity of 5.5 or so to the dollar. And if we thought we were going to have difficulties at 3.2 pesos to the dollar, we'll be unable to export to Mexico at 5.5. There will be a huge, tremendous incentive to establish American plants and other plants from around the globe in Mexico at that valuation. And this administration and this Congress doesn't seem concerned about it. The only thing they seem concerned about is ensuring that there be a loan guarantee for a restructuring of the existing loans. A restructuring that, in my judgment, would be done without the guarantees because the lenders have no option but to extend the maturities. If a lender gives $100,000, the lender owes the borrower. If a lender gives $40 billion, the borrower owns the lender. And we ought to be very, very careful before we proceed to do it without hearings, to do it without examination and cross-examination, debases the democratic process. What they're saying is, this is so important and so big that we can't have hearings. We can't have it tested in the crucible of public opinion, which is the committee hearing process of the House of Representatives and the Senate. That doesn't wash, not in my district at any event.
Well, the gentleman should be the very first person to be a part of such a hearing, because there is no one in this body that knows more about the internal debt structure of Mexico. And it is an outrage. It is an outrage to this Congress and to the new leadership in this place that they would try to muzzle the minds, not just of the people here, but also of the American people, and not permit them to know what this is all about when they have to foot the bill. It is absolutely outrageous. You have, to me, a special right to be a part of those hearings, and I think would make a positive contribution to putting Mexico on a sounder footing toward the future. I personally don't believe this is the way to do it, because you can't have free trade without free countries. And I think Mexico needs a good dose of democracy as a basis for economic growth in the future. And I know the time of our special order is expired, and we thank all of those who have been a part of this this evening, especially Congressman LaFalce, Congressman Lipinski, Congressman Sanders, those who have joined us to inform the American people. Thank you so very much, and I yield back.